Welcome back to Hold Fast, where we have biblical truths for daily battles. My name is Kenny. I'm the host of the podcast, and for once, I'm not alone today because I have my good friend, fellow pastor, Nic Williams with me today. Welcome to the podcast.
Hey, I'm excited to be here, bud.
So some people know this, but some people may not know that I got to work alongside of and with Nic in Sarasota at the church he's at in South Shore Community Church. So served with Nic. I should have known this before I came on. I think 2 years, right?
Yeah,
Roughly.
something like that.
Yeah. And then I left him and abandoned him, and here I am. So
That is very true. I felt all those things.
that's a story for another time. But we're still friends, so that's a good thing.
We survived it.
At least I think we are.
Yeah.
So Nic, if you will tell the people a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you come from. We just said how we got connected, but yeah, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a pastor in Sarasota, Florida. We call this Paradise.
Mm.
Love this place. Been at the church South Shore where I met Kenny for about 8 years now, and having the time of my life. And two young kids, 12 and 13, and an amazing wife that keeps us all together at
Yep.
all times.
Yep.
And then kids play sports, travel, baseball, soccer, all the things. So it's a busy season, but an amazing season at the same time.
Man, I mean, travel baseball alone is a full-time job, so that that's unreal.
Yeah, it is rough. He's doing 3 to 4 nights a week right now, and then games on the weekends, and it's hard to juggle it all.
Yep. Well, that's cool. So yeah, how this whole thing came about is, I mean, first of all, I've wanted to do something with you for quite some time, but I was listening to your podcast that I'll link in the show notes for people who are interested in that. And you made a comment about the fact that as a pastor, you have just noticed and seen how marriages have really been struggling around you lately, even more so than normal. And that resonated with me because I felt like I'm seeing a lot of that too. And I'm seeing people struggle who I didn't necessarily expect to see struggle.
Yeah.
And by the way, let me say this is probably a good thing to say up front, and I think you would agree with me on this. We are not coming from this conversation as two guys who have this completely figured out or two guys who do not struggle in their marriages. But I guess what we're seeing is people are not really coming to us as pastors until it's almost too late. We don't ever believe it's too late with the Lord, but that there's that aspect of it where it feels that way. And so you said that, and that just kind of resonated with me. I don't know if you had any initial thoughts on just that comment that you made in general.
No, I feel like we're the last resort. They've tried everything, and so they come to the pastor to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
And so many times I think, man, I wish you'd come so much sooner.
Yeah.
You've dug yourself a hole. You've done so much damage, and like I'm willing to dig out of that hole with anybody.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think the marriages that I'm seeing collapse around our county, in our community, within our church, is heartbreaking and painful for both those in it and those watching it. And uh, I started realizing maybe a couple of years ago, but it hit me hard about a year ago. I know you don't struggle with this, but we're professional communicators. Like that's what we do for a living.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found that I can communicate everywhere except at home sometimes.
Mm.
And I thought, man, as much as I pride myself on being able to communicate and help people navigate, like sometimes at my own house, I struggle communicating. And I thought, man, if I'm struggling with that as a person that studies communication and relationships and spiritual walks, how much more are other people struggling with it? And so I just decided about a year ago to take a deep dive into communication and marital issues and try to figure out how can I better help people instead of waiting till they get to that point that now I'm really scrambling to figure out how to help them. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm with you. And like I said, we don't come at this from two guys who have this figured out by any means. So you watch some of this stuff happen with the marriages and people are coming to you for counsel. And a lot of times I relate exactly to what they have going on because we have some of those same struggles. But yeah, I mean, it seems like people are so much less equipped to deal with it than in generations past, or maybe possibly they're just a little bit more honest about their struggles than some generations past as well. But that's another conversation. So I guess that really leads into what kind of got you passionate about this topic in general, because you are starting to do a lot more podcasting and even writing about this subject, right?
It is. I on one side I felt like I don't have time to do anything else. But on the other side, I thought, man, I can't sit back and not address what is apparently happening all around me.
Yeah.
And I could address it just within my church and try and help it here. But I do think it's a larger cultural issue that the church is reflecting the ideals of the culture instead of reflecting the ideals of the church. And
Yeah.
when we get into that mode, all of a sudden, divorce becomes a lot easier of a conversation where it shouldn't be an easy conversation. And I mean, I could go as far as say it shouldn't be a conversation at all.
Right.
You should be thinking, how can I fight for this? And how can I better the situation I'm in right now?
Yeah. Every time a couple has come to me, several times I've had people come to me and just one person from the marriage will come first to share what's going on. And I will be very upfront with them. I'll tell them, if you're coming to me because you're hoping I'm going to give you a reason to back out of this marriage, there's no point in you being here, because I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
Now, I think there's a qualifier as a pastor. If somebody's in an unsafe situation, abuse, things like that, of course, we seek to remove them from that situation. But we're not going to advocate for divorce at the end of the day. There's biblical grounds for divorce. That's a whole nother conversation. But we as pastors have that heart that we believe God can restore any situation, right? And so that's something that's kind of a ground rule that I set up with anybody who comes to me. I think this is an important question to ask too in this conversation. Like, why would this conversation matter for somebody else to listen to? Why does it matter what two pastors have to say about what they're observing in marriage in general, and how can that actually be meaningful to somebody who's listening to this who may or may not be struggling in their marriage?
Yeah, I think you and I sit in a unique place. Not that everybody doesn't have a friend that's gone through marital problems or had their own. But the volume of conversations you and I have to have with people on relational issues, on marriage, on sex, on finances, on forgiveness, the volume that you and I speak to in this has uniquely positioned us to really help some people.
Yep.
Now that all comes from a spiritual side, right? And I think that's the key, is you can get advice from anybody. And I think I see that happening more and more. We dealing with a family in our church right now that is struggling with that. The advice they're getting is not biblical advice, but they're following it.
Right.
And I'm thinking, man, you're missing the mark. Yet you have the community around you that has faith. And
Yep.
so I think for you and I to have this conversation and to allow other people to sit in on this, because you and I could do this over coffee, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But to allow other people to sit in on this, my hope, honestly, is it just opens up somebody's heart, and it opens up some conversation in somebody's relationship to say, you know what, let's talk.
Yep.
Let's sit down with our pastor. Let's find somebody that shares the same common values as us to help us navigate a situation that obviously is tense and hard.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that so much of modern psychology, counseling, those realms deal with the behaviors, which can be important. But as pastors, we're seeking to take the scriptures and deal with the heart and see a heart transformation, right? And I think that's one of the biggest distinctions between why would you go to a pastor versus a counselor. And I'm not saying don't go to a counselor. There are times that I recommend that to my people, but I'm even recommending for the most part that they go to a biblical counselor, somebody who's going to still do the same thing. They're trained professionally to do this, but they're going to walk with you through the word so that you can see true heart transformation and not just behavior modification. So yeah, that's good. So you've done a little bit of this, but maybe let's talk about, like, what are some of the things. I think this is an important question. Maybe number one, so some people don't feel alone in their struggles, but also so they know we're not just talking out of nowhere on this. What are some of the things that you're seeing in marriages? Obviously, without giving away any specifics or details about situations, but what are some of the things that you're seeing in marriages that are troubling for you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a laundry list, right?
Hmm.
Infidelity is what we probably think of the most,
Hmm.
and it exists and it happens. But I wouldn't say that that's the one that is everybody's issue. I think the biggest thing that I deal with in my counseling here at the church is unforgiveness.
Mm.
And that could stem around a lot of different things. It plays out in uh, lack of intimacy and lack of communication, but for some reason, people are just holding on to things that they can't let go of. And I think that's a pattern. There's
Mm.
a million books that are written on how to forgive, and
Right.
they new ones keep coming out because it's an issue that we can't seem to solve.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, I would agree with that. And I think that there's so many things that play into that unforgiveness, or that the
Yeah,
fruit that bears. But I see so much of ignoring issues as well. Like there's that unforgiveness mixed in with the fact that they haven't even expressed that they've been hurt to their spouse about a certain situation, or they've not expressed it properly. And so not only do you have unforgiveness, but now you have all this time that's passed of bitterness and anger that's built up, and it just comes to fruition one day. And the other spouse in some of these situations is going, I don't even know where this is coming from, but it happened a long time ago and they never even talked about it.
yeah. I would say I mean, just being personal, like that's a struggle of mine. Like I'd rather just move past things than
Right.
talk about them.
Yep.
It's not that I hate controversy. I mean, I hate it as much as the next person, but
Hmm.
I'd rather everybody just get along. But something happens when you don't communicate, when you
Yep.
don't talk about the things that hurt you and just
Hmm.
move past them. They
Hmm.
start to build up, and you may not feel it at first, but at some point, those dominoes are going to fall, and all of a sudden, you're really mad at your spouse over something small, but it's really you've had this laundry list of things that have hurt you, and you've never expressed it in a way that uh, opens a conversation. And maybe it was unintentional on the other side. I mean, it
Hmm.
could have been intentional, but a lot of times
Right.
it's so unintentional that you've been hurt and you've allowed a fracture in your relationship over something that you have ruminated in your mind and built to a level that didn't exist.
Yeah. Yeah. I'll talk a little bit more about this maybe towards the end when we talk about some practical things to do. But um, one of the things that I believe couples should do more often is on a weekly basis, ask each other, is there anything that I need to ask for forgiveness for? Like, is there any way that I've hurt you? And then also be willing to express, like, here's something that you did to me that we hadn't got a chance to talk about yet. It's so much easier to do that right away than once
Yeah.
you've let it fester. Because if I start bringing up something you did a year ago, I mean, of course, that's going to blindside my wife, and that's going to cause her to go, what in the world took you so long to even bring that up, you know?
Yeah.
But it breeds more sin, more bitterness, and it never ends well. Um, yeah, I think that probably is at the heart of a lot of the issues that we're seeing. And as a pastor, what good of a pastor would I be if I didn't talk about the fact that at the end of the day, marriage is like anything else. We struggle because of our sinful desires, and we struggle
Yep.
because of our own hearts. And marriage is a work of sanctification. It's a means by which I think the Lord uses to make us more like Christ. As we sin and need forgiveness, as we go through life together, we're bringing our baggage and sin into that marriage, and we need a spouse who sees that, who forgives that, and who we do the same for. And so we need to recognize that. We're not alone in these struggles. No marriage is perfect, and every marriage is going to have conflict at some point because it's two sinful people in need of grace coming together. And we need to be extending that grace on a regular basis.
Yeah, I love. I think it's Paul David Tripp wrote a book called Marriage. It
Mhm.
originally was titled "What Did You Expect,"
Mhm.
but it has that concept all throughout. It's a hard book to read, honestly, but it says the problem in your marriage is you.
Yep.
It's that you have this sinful nature, and you married somebody with a sinful nature.
Yep.
So if you're expecting to not have problems, you've missed the mark.
Yeah.
And when your focus is so much on their sin nature and never your sin nature, you're missing it as well. I like to think when I'm talking with couples that um, every issue that we have comes down to a spiritual issue.
Hmm.
Whether it's your focus has gone off your relationship with God, whether your focus as a couple has gone off your relationship with God.
Hmm.
I think all of our issues come up when we shift from God to us,
Yep.
and it's hard not to. I mean, we're
Yep.
selfish people, and that's how we live. We want gratification on our
Hmm.
own, but um, it's hard. It is a hard journey when we try to do it all on our own.
Yep. Every time I officiate a wedding, I have a quote that I share that goes something like, your real enemy in your marriage is not across the bed, but it's in your own heart. That's your enemy in your marriage, and a lot of times we think it's our spouse. We think they're the problem, but that's the other thing that I do. Every time a couple comes to me, I will say to each spouse in some way, shape, or form, I don't want to talk to you about your spouse's sin. I want to talk to you about your sin and how you can deal with that. And I'm going to talk to your spouse about their sin and what they need to do. And we can't. You and I can't fix your wife, right?
Yeah,
Jesus does that, and so I'm trying to lead them to Jesus, just the same as I'm trying to lead you to Christ as we talk and counsel together.
yeah, it's so true. And
Yep.
I think one of the things I tell in premarital counseling is that for the rest of your life, you should be a student of your spouse.
Hmm.
That is in that book that I was mentioning a moment ago. Paul said something along the lines that things go wrong when couples think they've reached the point when they can retire from their marital work and
Hmm.
just chill out, lie back, and slide, and just think it's going to happen.
Yep.
And I think that happens too often. Is we work on dating, we work on meeting our spouse, we work on wooing that person, we work on the wedding day, then
Hmm.
we get married and we think the work's over. And then we wonder why, man, I thought this was just going to be easy. And culture has painted it that way, that you
Yep.
have these fairy tale endings. But they don't come without work. And so, like, if you want your marriage to be a reflection of who God has called you to be and the marriage that God wants you to have, you've got to work at it. And I
Yep.
think in the seasons that my marriage has struggled, um, and don't misinterpret that, Lori and I have an incredible marriage.
Yeah.
We've been married almost 18 years now, and she's the love of my life, and we grow closer every day. But in the seasons that we've struggled the most, has been when I've become so focused on other things,
Hmm.
whether it's the things of God. I'm focused on the church and work and the kids and providing for the family. So it's not bad things I'm focused on,
Yep.
but I've become so focused on that that I stopped working on the marriage. And then all of a sudden, and this will resonate with a lot of people, you feel like you're living with a roommate,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
You all of a sudden your spouse is just a roommate that you live with, and when you hit that point, you're like, oh no, what went wrong?
Yep.
And at that point, you've got to make a decision. And I think too many people are choosing that moment as they're out
Hmm.
instead of saying, all right, well, I've done something I shouldn't have done. Maybe I haven't done some major sin, but I've neglected my duties as a husband or wife.
Yep.
And it's my job now to step back in and be who God's called me to be.
Yep. Yeah. That is, I mean, you hit the nail on the head with so many situations. It's like the buildup happens where they haven't communicated well or talked about it, and it's kind of gone untreated. They get to a point where it all reaches a head, and they think, well, there's nothing we can do now. And when I said earlier something like, people wait to come to us until it's too late. I don't actually believe it's too late, but they've waited until they believe that it's too late,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And I can't convince somebody that it's not too late at the end of the day. Jesus can, but that's so true. And I think if people are listening to this by chance and you are at that place where you're starting to realize, man, I think it's too late. I mean, I want to say to you, it never is. And that sounds so cliche, like something that a pastor would say. But I can tell you that I've seen situation after situation that I really thought there's no hope here, and the Lord redeemed it. I knew that with men there was no hope here, but I always knew that with the
Yeah.
Lord that this can be redeemed. And I mean, I believe that you're going to see that over and over again if you'll really just take the Lord at his word. He desires that your marriage actually stay intact. He desires that you flourish in your marriage. And so pray for that and seek that end. And I believe the Lord will bless that. Now, having said that, we are sinful people, and there are times where the other spouse is just not gonna, they're not gonna go for it. You might have the
Yeah.
hope, and you can't force them to
Yeah.
do that. And those are painful situations. But you also, in that situation, you just keep praying that the Lord changes their heart too. He's the one who does the work, and he can do it even in the most hopeless of situations.
Yeah. And I think it's an interesting thought, because that's a hard season as a pastor, to sit in a room where one spouse wants it
Mhm.
and the other has convinced themselves they're done.
Yep.
Um, because the pain is real.
Yep.
The situation they found themselves in is hurtful.
Yep.
But you also know the cost that stepping away from that marriage is going to cause for everybody involved.
Hmm. Especially if there's kids too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's make a little bit of a shift somewhat. I mean, we're talking about why some of this is happening and what we're seeing. But a question that's in my mind too that I've thought a lot about is, why are we seeing so much of this in the church, right? If Christians are the ones who have a biblical view of marriage and have the truth and have Christ and the Holy Spirit in us, why are we seeing so much of this happen in the church? And I know that's a very general question. We could talk about a lot of specifics, but how is it that Christians seem to be struggling in some senses just as much as those who are non-Christians are in their marriages?
Yeah. You've opened up a can there that I don't know that we can unpack.
Right.
And here's my just straight truthful answer is, I think too many Christians live a Sunday faith.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that's culturally how we've designed church these days.
Hmm.
Um, I think as pastors, that's not our heart, but that's what's going on. And so
Hmm.
people come to church on Sunday, they worship, they love God. Hopefully they get something out of the words you and I are saying. And they go about their week, and their week is not centered around God.
Yep.
And I can speak to this as a pastor as well, because I told you, like, we're extremely busy. I've got a soccer game at 4 o'clock. I've got a baseball game at 6 o'clock. I'll get home at 9:30 tonight, and I'll get up
Mhm.
tomorrow and do it all over again.
Yep.
And so our lives are not filled with God; they're filled with the world.
Hmm.
And so when problems hit, we don't have the solid foundation that we think we have.
Hmm.
And so we look to the world for answers. We may say that we look to God to answers, and we may pray for God to fix something, but most of our prayers are looking for a patch or something simple. God,
Yep.
just fix it and let me move on so I can be happy. We're not actually wanting God to refine us
Hmm.
and purify us into the next season of who He wants us to be.
Yeah. Yeah, that Sunday only faith plays out a lot like that, where people have this thought in their minds that, well, I go to church and my pastor tells me I should pray for God to do things in my life. And so I'm going to pray that he fixes my marriage. But they don't realize that oftentimes when we pray that, the Lord is going to use us to be the one to fix our marriage, right? And we actually
Yeah.
have to put in the work for that. Something that's fascinating that I don't have the exact statistics in front of me, but I've done a little bit of reading and research on the fact that, people will say all the time that the divorce rate among Christians is the same as non-Christians. And that's true to an extent, but when you actually go deeper in the statistics, they've done some work to see that that's only true by those who simply claim to be Christian. The statistics are not the same when you start talking about people who actually live out a committed faith in Christ.
Yeah.
Christians who are, yes, going to church on a weekly basis, but they're also having family worship in their homes, and they're reading their Bibles, and they're praying, and they're actually discipling their children. When you get into situations like that, the divorce rate plummets. The satisfaction rate in their marriages skyrockets. I mean, it's a stark difference between committed Christians and nominal Christians.
Yeah.
So I think what that tells me is that it's not necessarily that the divorce rate is the same in Christian households as non-Christian households. I think when people actually are living out their faith, and really keeping their relationship with Christ at the center of their lives, their marriage, all these things, you're going to see blessings from that. It's not that those people are better people than everybody else and that they're just stronger in their marriage. It's that they're actually depending on Christ and they're actually following in his ways. And he tells us in his word, when you do that, you'll see the blessings of that. I mean, it's so Christianity 101, but when you put it like that, people want to say, well, you're just being legalistic or whatever. But the truth is, you put in the work and you do marriage the way that God intends for you to, then your marriage will have the results that God intends for your marriage to have. And I just don't think people want to recognize that and want to actually do the work that that's going to take to see that happen.
Yeah, and that's the problem. I think it's work, and
Hmm.
everybody wants simple fixes these days,
Yep.
and we want everything to be simple. And so in our marriage, we want it to be simple too. And truth be told, there are some simple days.
Yep.
There are some moments that are just easy, but there are some that take work. And when there's pain and there's hurt and unforgiveness and all the things that bring the struggle, those things aren't quick fixes. Those are
Yep.
work moments.
Yep.
I can't remember who said this, and so I'll claim the quote and just sound really smart. They said something along the lines that forgiveness is really hard, but the harvesting of forgiveness can be a very beautiful thing.
Hmm.
And I that resonates with me as I think about people that I counsel with, that's one of their big issues is forgiveness over whatever the issue is. Um, that the work put in to find forgiveness, man, the beauty that comes on the backside of that, if you can get to that, is absolutely incredible. The
Hmm.
testimony, the life change, the communication difference that happens in a relationship that has gone through hard times and worked through them is a beautiful moment. And you and I both know testimonies of people that have been on the other side
Yep.
that you thought, man, they're not going to make it.
Yep.
I'm at my wit's end on how to help them, and then God does something miraculous in their marriage, and all of a sudden you look at it and think, man, that can only be the work of God.
Yep. Absolutely. That because that was kind of the next thing I was going to transition to was what are some of the success stories that we're seeing, and again, not necessarily specific details of people's lives, but I mean, I can think of several situations right off the top of my head where I mean, I'm a young pastor still, and I got into a few situations early on in being a senior pastor here where I kind of got thrown into the fire, not expecting what I was going to walk into. And in a few of these situations, I just thought to myself, I don't even know what to tell these people. Like I
Yeah.
got my flashcard answers, from the Bible that I want to give them, but they don't want to hear any of that. And it just seems hopeless. And I'll keep going. Lord, I know you're able to do this, but I just don't see a path forward. I mean, it really has to be of you. And then what happens is, this is the thing I want people to hear. It's not as if God just like zaps the husband and wife and just all of a sudden they're better and everything's
Yeah.
amazing. They actually begin to say, you know what? Let's try this. Let's actually try to do this God's way. Let's lay aside our pride. Let's forgive. Let's pursue these things together. And then over time, it gets better. There's very few, if any, situations where it just overnight, everything's better. Like there was just a big misunderstanding and it wasn't that big of a deal. Like that's what we want. It's what you're saying, right? We want that quick fix. We want
Yeah.
our spouse to think it wasn't that big of a deal. But it takes a lot of humility to say, I've contributed to the state of where this marriage is at. And for both spouses to say that, like, I've contributed to this in my own sin or neglect or whatever it may be. I've done this. I'm going to work on me. And this is another thing I tell people in premarital counseling. Marriage, we want marriage to be 50-50, but it's not. It's not,
Yeah.
I'm gonna put in my part and you do your part. It's I'm giving 100% of myself into this marriage, whether you do or not. I'm committed to my role as a husband or wife in this marriage, whether you are or not. Because when Paul gives that instruction in Ephesians chapter 5, he doesn't say, husbands, love your wives as Christ has loved the church, unless she's really difficult. He doesn't say to wives, submit to your husbands as to the Lord, unless he's just a terrible person. I mean, it's just do your role, like do what God's called you to do in the marriage, honor the Lord and let him work out the results. And there's actually a very encouraging passage in 1 Corinthians 7 that even speaks to a believing spouse who has an unbelieving spouse. And Paul's like, what do you do? He says to the believing spouse, you stay because you actually have a sanctifying effect on your unbelieving spouse. You actually, by committing yourself to Christ, continuing to humble yourself and live out your role, even if your spouse is not doing that, actually is going to have an effect, and you've got to trust the Lord in that. I think that's a powerful thing, and something that we've got to remember. All the success stories happen when the husband and the wife say, I'm going to do this God's way and let him work in my marriage. And I'm going to stop bucking up against that.
Yeah, I mean, it's so true. I think you said something that just reminded me of several counseling moments I've been in where one spouse has said, "I'm not trying anymore," because they stopped trying.
Right.
And I love how you said it. I mean, whether you're going to or not, I'm 100% in.
Hmm.
I'm gonna 100% do what I'm called to do. And I think more people have to get to that point. I mean, and realize, man, I've made this covenant with my
Yep.
spouse.
Yep.
I've not. It's not just a legal document with the state.
Yep.
It's a covenant between me, my spouse, and God that I am upholding here. And therefore, as we say it, what God has joined together, let no man separate.
Yep.
And that man includes you. Like, don't let you be the one that separates what God has put together.
Yep.
Now, I do think on the other end of this, Kenny, like there could be people listening today that they've gone through divorce, or
Hmm.
they're at a space where it's just not going to work out. And I do think it matters to say that, like, that doesn't mean that life's over. That doesn't mean
Yep.
that God's done with you.
Yep.
I sit with people that have been divorced, that God is doing incredible things in their life. And I think sometimes people wear that as a defeated moment, and
Yep.
partly because of how the church has set this up. And
Right.
so if you are listening and you're in that stage, I want you to know God still has great plans for you. It's not,
Yep.
life's not over because this has happened. The purpose of Kenny and I's talk today is to encourage you, if you haven't signed that document,
Hmm.
to spend some time with God and work on what God has called you into.
Yep. And we're not trying to paint a butterfly and rainbows picture of just do what God
No,
wants you to do and everything will be beautiful. It might
yeah,
be really hard for a really long time, and it might continue to be hard. But just because it's hard doesn't mean that it's not worth doing. And just because it's hard doesn't mean that God's not at work in the midst of it. And yeah, I mean, I'm glad you said that. I don't want anybody who has walked through the pain of divorce to think that we are casting judgment on them in that way, because that's a hard and painful thing. But it and by no means means that your life is over and God's done with you. God restores that situation as well, and can bring beautiful things out of the difficulty of that as well. So I'm glad you brought that up. So and we've done this throughout, but I want to get really specific and practical towards the end here. What do we do with all this? Like, what are some of the
uh,
things that we want to say to those in marriages, like who may be either they may not be at a critical point, but they may realize things are just not great. They may be at a great point in their marriage and they just need some encouragement to keep going further, or they may be at that point of feeling hopeless. No matter where they're at, what are some of the practical things you and I want to say to couples and are saying to couples who sit across from us that you need to be doing? How can you begin to improve your marriage and build into it to honor Christ?
yeah, I think there's so many practical tools. I mentioned to you a couple weeks ago that I've written a devotional, and it started out as a couples devotional, a 6-week devotional. And then I started thinking, if couples are in a crisis, spending one day a week together talking about God probably isn't going to turn the tides very much for them. And
Mhm.
so I converted it to a 31 day, just intentional every day for 31 days, talking about God, marriage, and relationship. And day three is forgiveness. And that's a hard thing to bring up on day three of a
Yep.
devotional.
Yep.
And so I'm walking people that. So I think intentional time at home with your spouse, talking about God and your relationship is step one. I mean,
Mhm.
just getting that communication out there. One of the tools I like to use with most of my couples is what I call replacement therapy. And that's usually if something has happened and there's a bad memory around it, and all the time that comes up, let's replace that memory. For
Mhm.
example, I have a family that uh, years ago the spouse got divorced, and for whatever reason that day that she got married the first time is still a painful day for her. Like, she
Mhm.
remembers it and the pain that she went through. And the husband had come in and talked to me and said, I don't know what to do. Like, I feel like a jerk every day on that year, thinking
Yeah.
I'm the new husband. Why are we still mourning that?
Yeah.
And so we sat down as the three of us and just said, hey, how can we replace that memory? And they did. They created the next year on that day a new memory for the two of them to hold on to.
Mhm.
to celebrate rather than to mourn the past. And so I use that tool a lot with couples to just think, man, where have you been hurt? How can we replace that memory with something new?
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. In recent memory, and literally within the last year, a pastor friend of mine sent an image to me that contains, I don't even know the number off the top of my head, 5 or 6 questions. And he calls it the weekly check-in.
Yeah.
And Jenna and I started implementing this, and it has been one of the best things we've done in our marriage because it's so easy, especially with kids in the home, but even without kids, just with busy lives and schedules, it's so
Yeah.
easy to just coast. And like we've said, not deal with the issues, not talk about it. But these questions literally say things like, give 2 or 3 ways you're thankful for your spouse. What sin have you struggled with the most this week? What do I need to ask for forgiveness for? What's our schedule look like this week? How can I pray for you? How can I love you well this week? Like, those simple but sometimes hard questions once a week have been transformative, and I don't use that word lightly. It's been so huge for us, and it allows you to deal with issues before they really become issues. I can't tell you how many times we've had these conversations and they've gone like 2 hours, and then some weeks it takes 5 minutes, right?
Yeah.
But if we were not intentional about it, some of these conversations would just get postponed and postponed and postponed. And so I'm going to link those few questions to in the show notes as well for anybody who wants that, because I would highly encourage, almost to the point of requiring, if I could, couples need to do some form of that once a week at least. Doesn't have to be those specific questions. We don't always do those specific questions. Sometimes I just say on that day, like, hey, what's been going on? What do you want to talk about? And that leads to a good conversation. But that's huge. I just think that is one of the greatest tools that's so simple that you can implement and make a big difference.
Yeah. And I think this one is kind of generic. We've used this over and over again in the church, and that's having a date night or a date day. Um,
Yep.
and I'll only mention it because Lori and I are horrible at this. We're we probably our personal relationship, our marriage is the last thing that we work on. And so we've tried to be more intentional about that. And we're both off on Fridays. And so now Fridays are our day. And
Yep.
sometimes that means we just sit at home and watch TV together.
Hmm.
Sometimes we go on a walk. Most of the time we find lunch at a restaurant somewhere.
Yep.
But just making sure, hey, kids are out. We know they're gone for an amount of time. Let's be intentional with this time. And I think we used to try to force it into something bigger than it needed to be. And
Mm.
that's why we never did it. We always said,
Yep.
well, that needs to be more time or a nicer restaurant. And so we finally just nailed it down to it just needs to be time,
Yep.
just quality time, like real time together, to where we can talk and laugh and all the things.
Yep. Yeah, that's so key. Another thing I would add, there's a few things in my mind. So we're having this conversation as two pastors, and we've said several times in this, people come to us when they think it's too late. Don't do that.
Oh yeah.
I would actually say, even if your marriage is amazing right now, you could still benefit from counseling and help. And even if it's just a couple, another married couple who are Christians, who are friends that you just sit down and just talk with life and marriage about, or maybe it's your pastor or a counselor, or whatever. Don't wait. I mean, seriously, even if you're, I have a friend who every couple years, he and his wife just go to a counselor just because they just plan to do it. Like whether their marriage is good or bad or indifferent, doesn't matter. They just go just because
Yep.
they want that. On that same note, here's another recommendation that was given to my wife and I that we thought was helpful. Have somebody in your life that you both agree upon who, and it could be your pastor, it could be a friend, whoever, who, if you feel like your spouse is not listening to you or not getting it, you can go to. And both of you have this option with this same person. And it's somebody who you know is not going to be biased, who you know is going to speak truth, who you know is going to constantly pray for you and encourage you. I think that's a great tool to have it. And that's kind of an ongoing accountability in your marriage too, right? That I know if I ignore my wife for some period of time, she's got somebody she can go to who's going to call me out on that, and I can't just do that without accountability. So,
Yeah.
I think that's another helpful thing.
Yeah. And I think too, we're a lot of this is on what can they do as a couple, but I think individually as well, if your marriage is struggling, one of the first things I would tell somebody to do is check your faith, spend some time with God, make sure that you're not just checking the boxes and showing up at church every week, that you're actually building a relationship with God. Because as we said earlier, I mean, sin nature is on both sides, right? You got to make sure that you're doing the work with your relationship with God first. And the last thing I would throw in there is, I kind of equate it to my wife. My wife's a dental hygienist, and so every year she has to do continuing education classes to keep her license up. Yet with marriage, we never learn anything or try to grow in our marriage. And so there are so many resources out there, whether it's on how to communicate better, whether it's just marriage enrichment weekends. I mean, there's so much out there. Make that a part of your regular continuing education, if you will. I want to learn how to be a better husband to my wife. I want to learn how to be a better parent to my kids. And I'm not going to let that happen by chance. I'm going to be intentional in my growth to make sure I'm doing all that I can do to be the best that I can be for them.
Yep. I could not sign off without saying what everybody would expect a pastor to say. And it's, again, it sounds cliche or whatever, but you can't not remind married couples the importance of praying together consistently, spending time in God's word together consistently. You need your own individual relationship with Christ, yes, but you also need to do that together. And husbands, the scripture I think is clear. You're called to take the lead in that. You're called to make sure that the spiritual temperature of your family is where it needs to be. That doesn't mean wives don't play a role in that, or that wives are not as spiritual. No, it just means the husband has the calling to make sure that initiative is taken. And, that whether you feel like you're equipped for that or not, God has called you to it and he'll equip you for it.
Yep.
And it doesn't have to be a theology lesson. My wife doesn't want that from me. She wants me to pray for her and with her. And that's an easy thing to do if you just take a few minutes to do it.
Yes, for sure.
So awesome. Is there anything you feel like we missed in this conversation? I mean, obviously we could go forever, but any important points that you wanted to bring up?
No, I think it's a good starting conversation. And I would just encourage people, man, live where you're at, but don't do it alone. Build around your community, seek help if you need it. But don't be afraid to do the work. Yep.
That's good. Well, I appreciate you having this conversation. You mentioned it earlier, but I wanted you to maybe emphasize it one more time. You said you got a devotional. Is it actually out yet?
It should be out already. It's not. It's coming out May 10th.
Okay.
And so you can find it at southshorechurch.com. We'll put a link on there for that. And it's just a 31-day intentional devotional. It's not complicated. I've tried to make it as easy as I can. I just want people to actually have real conversations with their spouse. And for some reason, we make it harder than it has to be. And so I'm trying to make it easy.
Good. Yeah, that's awesome. We'll link to that. I'll link to your podcast as well if people want to hear you talk a little bit more. And if you're listening to this, you already heard my podcast, so you know where to go. But I appreciate you coming on, man. I hope this was a helpful conversation to those who are listening. And what I tell my audience each time, I'll say again, I mean, if you hear this and you've got more questions or thoughts, let me know. If you got my number, text me. My email address is kennyroberts@missionwaychurch.org. Would love to hear from you and go deeper in some of these topics if you want me to. But thanks again for coming on, Nic.
Hey, I love it. Let's do it again.
Yes, sir.